Thank you for joining us again. Another one of our Safer at Home series talks. Always glad to have you on board. A couple of things before we get started. As you know, all our talks are brought to us by Cape Cod 5, First Citizens Federal Credit Union, and Martha's Vineyard Savings. Books for everybody on our series are available at Eight Cousins Bookseller in Falmouth. So we hope that you visit the locals. Our guest tonight, Dennis Rasmussen, a professor of political science at Syracuse. He's a political theorist whose research focuses on the Enlightenment, the American founding, and the virtues and shortcomings of liberal democracy and market capitalism. He is also no stranger to New England because he's taught at Tufts, Brown, and Bowdoin. This is his fourth book. Would you welcome our guest tonight, Dennis Rasmussen?
Thank you, Mark, and thank you all for I guess coming. It's weird to talk about coming to a talk on Zoom, but attending the talk on Zoom. So I'm going to talk today about my new book. As Mark said, it's my fourth book. It's called Fears of a Setting Sun, and the theme of the book is the late life disillusionment of the American founders with America, with the American regime. So I hit upon the idea for this book almost by happenstance. Like many Americans, I've long enjoyed reading the big popular biographies of the founders that seem to come out almost every year. But it often struck me that while the stories were generally meant to be inspiring and uplifting, the endings were never entirely happy. In fact, by the end of their lives, almost all the leading founders end up being rather deeply disappointed in the government and the nation that they'd helped to create. This seemed to me like a point worth pursuing, and I was surprised to find, when I started to look around at the scholarship on the period, I was surprised to find that no one had really pursued this in a systematic way. So I decided to have a go at it myself. And once I started methodically going through the founders' letters and other writings, disillusionment was really all over the place. So I'm not pulling at strings here or inferring disillusionment from a few stray comments. There's just a vast historical record attesting to the founders' anxieties and in many cases even despair about the country's future. Which is all the more striking because they're keenly aware that everything that they wrote would be pored over by posterity. You know, when they're writing their letters, they know that future generations are going to read them. But their growing disappointment in what America had become wasn't something that they were even trying to hide. So for each of them, there are just dozens and dozens of letters and other writings, if not hundreds in the case of John Adams, in which they bemoan the fate of the country, often in really overwrought, near hysterical terms. And this is really a striking thing, right? Given the perennial interest that Americans have in their founders, it strikes me as amazing that this isn't better known or more talked about. Now, we rightly, I think, don't deify the founders in quite the way we once did, right? We're keenly aware of their manifold and manifest flaws with regard to slavery, above all, their treatment of the American Indian tribes, and so on and so forth. But we do tend to still, I think, exalt and even venerate what the founders founded, namely the Constitution, the American form of government. I mean, of course, you hear people want to modify the system at the margins all the time, right? Get rid of the Electoral College or whatever it might be. But my sense is that most Americans still absolutely revere the Constitution, despite having, in the great majority of cases, I think, never actually read it. So certainly no politician could hope to win election by criticizing the Constitution wholesale, right? Or saying that we need to fundamentally revamp it in some way or whatever. And moreover, when our politics go awry, many Americans tend to assume that things have gone wrong because we failed in some way to live up to the founders' vision, right? That if we could somehow manage to fulfill their expectations, then all would be well. And that's one reason why I think that thus far, many of the book's readers and reviewers have been surprised by the theme, by by learning that the founders were, again, at least by the end of their lives, far less confident in the merits of the political system they devised, that many of them, in fact, deemed it an utter failure that was unlikely to last beyond their own generation. So like The book itself, my talk today is going to focus on 4 of the preeminent figures of the period: George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson, each of whom lost their faith in the American experiment at different times for different reasons. Each has its own unique story. And so just to sort of preview what I'll be talking about today, there's a certain theme associated with each of the 4 figures. So Washington became disillusioned above all because of the rise of parties and partisanship. Hamilton, because he felt that the federal government wasn't sufficiently vigorous or energetic. Adams, because he believed that the American people lacked the requisite civic virtue for Republican government. And then finally, Jefferson, because of the sectional divide that was laid bare by conflict over the spread of slavery. So I'll say more about each of those. But before I jump into them, I should note that these 4 are, I think, the most prominent 4 founders who grew disappointed in what America became, but they're far from the only ones. In fact, when I looked into it, most of the other leading founders who lived into the 19th century or even well into the 1790s fell in the same camp. So here I'm thinking of figures like Samuel Adams, Elbridge Gerry, Patrick Henry, John Jay, John Marshall, George Mason, James Monroe, Gouverneur Morris, Thomas Paine, Benjamin Rush. Most of the names that people know, other than, of course, Benjamin Franklin survived to see the government formed by the Constitution in action for only a single year. So he basically didn't have time to grow disillusioned. But besides him, the most notable founder who didn't come to despair for the country, the sort of proverbial exception that proves the rule, was James Madison, who did harbor some real worries from time to time, but on the whole remained fairly sanguine about the nation and its politics all the way until his death in 1836. So he outlived them all and retained his faith in a way that they didn't. So I'll also say a little bit toward the end of my talk about why Madison largely kept the Republican faith when so many of his compatriots didn't. Okay, so with that, let me turn to my 4 protagonists. I'll start again with Washington. So Washington, as the father of his country, as he was known even during his lifetime, his foremost wish for his progeny, for his country, was that it would remain free of political parties and partisanship. And so this wasn't unusual. All of the founders at least professed an aversion to parties, or factions as they were frequently called. This was a sort of stock theme of 18th century political discourse, to say factions are bad things. But really no one loathed them more fiercely and consistently and genuinely than Washington did. So part of his opposition to partisanship stemmed from the fact that he just took it as a sign of a bad character. That if you were a partisan, that meant you were partial, right? That you put the interests of some parochial group ahead of the public good, and that meant you weren't a true patriot, that you weren't exhibiting the kind of disinterested virtue that he so prized. But he also thought that parties would be fatal to Republican government. He thought that parties sow conflict among the people, they open the door to corruption, to foreign intrigue, and they just prevent the government from being well administered, where there's a standing opposition party whose whole point is to try to prevent the president, the leaders in Congress, from getting things done, right? Which isn't to say Washington wasn't entirely blind to the inevitability of disagreement, dissent, nor did he think it was always wrong for like-minded individuals to band together to further specific ends. But he did think that these kinds of alliances would be temporary, that basically once they had achieved their chosen end, they'd sort of naturally disband and assimilate back into the body politic. Now, if this sounds impossibly naive, as I think it will to many today, we should remember that the Constitution itself was devised under the assumption that parties would never emerge, right? So he's very much not alone in his naivete in this regard. I'd also say that there's something about this view that persists even today. Even today, Americans are more likely than the citizens of, I think, almost any other democracy to echo Washington's fears and aspirations here, to denounce the very idea of political parties, to demand that their politicians rise above mere partisanship. Now, I think political scientists are quick to point out that parties serve a number of really critical roles in democratic politics in terms of aggregating interests, mobilizing supporters, structuring voters' choices, providing collective accountability to the voters, and so on and so forth. I think most political scientists would say democracies can't really work without parties. But for the purposes of my argument about Washington, that doesn't matter really all that much, whether his ideal of nonpartisan, disinterested politics, whether it was a noble aspiration or a naive pipe dream, right? Either way, it was one of his fondest hopes for the country, and its disappointment cut him to the core. Because of course, America's first party system emerged within just a couple years after the Constitution was ratified, the new government was set up. In fact, many of you will know the two sides, the Federalists and Republicans, were led by a pair of bitter enemies within Washington's own cabinet, right? Secretary of the Treasury Hamilton, Secretary of State Jefferson, who fought, the two sides fought each other with a venom that would make some of the staunchest partisans of today blush, right? We're sometimes apt to picture this time, the early republic, as a time when wise patriots in these, powdered wigs and knee breeches and the like, they came together to rationally determine the country's best interests. But in fact, this period was marked by an unusually high level of acrimony and just plain nastiness. So the two sides regarded each other, treated each other, not just as opponents who had the wrong views, they advocated the wrong policies or whatever, but rather as enemies of the Constitution. So the Republicans generally regarded the Federalists as monarchists and tools of the British Crown. The Federalists saw the Republicans as basically Jacobins bent on instituting mob rule. So in every political debate, there were cries of treason, fears of foreign plots, physical violence was quite commonplace. And so predictably, all of this disheartened Washington, right? Over the course, as partisanship escalated over the course of the 1790s, Washington's confidence in America's future kind of correspondingly declined as the partisanship went up, right? So by 1792, which is the year he, I guess I was going to say ran for re-election, but he reluctantly accepted a second term as president. He'd already begun to bemoan the internal dissensions that he said were harrowing and tearing at our vitals, making it difficult, if not impracticable, to manage the reins of government or to keep the parts of it together. He warned Jefferson that unless the partisan bickering diminished, the Republican must inevitably be torn asunder. But of course, the partisanship didn't diminish. On the contrary, it grew continually worse over the course of his second term, and his outlook grew ever more bleak. He immortalized his worries for posterity in his famous farewell address of 1796, the great theme of which was the dangers of factionalism in its various guises. And this is the farewell is often read as kind of a warning about the future. These are the potential dangers Washington is fearing the country might someday face. But I argue that it's even better read as a lament about ills that he was sure had already beset it. These were things that had already happened to the country that he was lamenting. And then things got even worse. The state of American politics during his short retirement, he lived only 2.5 years beyond the presidency, but this only confirmed his darkest fears. So partisanship did reach a sort of fever pitch during the early years of the Adams administration. For those of you who know this period, this is in the midst of the undeclared quasi-war with France. And it got to the point where members of Congress were brawling on the floor of the House of Representatives with canes and fire pokers. There were violent mobs roaming the streets of Philadelphia, so much so that President Adams smuggled arms into the executive mansion as a kind of precautionary measure. So many people thought the country was basically on the point of civil war. And so in letter after letter during this time, Washington warned that these party feuds seemed unlikely to end at any point short of confusion and anarchy. He'd also come to the conclusion that it was no longer individuals and their virtues, but rather parties and their ideologies that won elections. So he told one correspondent that if the Republicans, I mean, he had drifted into the Federalist camp by this point. So that he said that if the Republicans were to set up a broomstick and called it a true son of liberty or a Democrat or whatever epithet would suit their purpose, it would command their votes in toto. And so this is really, he had become convinced that not just Congress, but the American people themselves had grown thoroughly and irretrievably partisan. And he'd always insisted since his days commanding the Continental Army that Republican government just couldn't survive under these conditions. And that's why I suggest that in some ways, Washington's political career was the reverse of his military career, right? So in politics, he won every election unanimously, of course. He got his way on almost every policy dispute. But in the end, he failed in his overarching desire to prevent partisanship from overrunning the country. So in politics, unlike in the Revolution, in politics, he won most of the battles, but lost the larger war. So just weeks before his death in December 1799, he wrote, quote, "I have for some time past viewed the political concerns of the United States with an anxious and painful eye. They appear to me to be moving by hasty strides to some awful crisis." That's, again, right before his death. Okay, so let me turn next to Hamilton. So you might think that, okay, sure, maybe the idealistic Washington was disappointed by the sometimes ugly realities of the new government, but surely Hamilton, the much more worldly, hard-bitten Hamilton, must have been more pleased by it, right? Especially given that he's the principal author of the greatest defense of the Constitution, the Federalist or Federalist Papers, and he did more as Washington's Treasury Secretary. He arguably did more than any other single individual to give the government that emerged from the Constitution shape and substance in his early years. In fact, though, Hamilton was among the most disappointed in the Constitution, even at the very outset. So at the end of the Philadelphia Convention, he said, well, I'll defend the Constitution. It's better than nothing. It's better than the Articles of Confederation. But he told his fellow delegates, at least according to James Madison's notes, he told his fellow delegates that no man's ideas were more remote from the plan, meaning the Constitution, than his were. So, and the main problem that, as Hamilton saw it, was that the government that they'd framed wouldn't have sufficient vigor or energy, was the word he liked to use, particularly in relation to the state governments. And he was a sort of outlier. Many of the other founders, Jefferson probably foremost among them, saw the exercise of governmental power, especially on the national level, as an almost inherent infringement on liberty. Hamilton took the opposite view. He always insisted that vesting too little power in the government was at least as dangerous as vesting too much power in it, that a weak government was at least as great a threat to liberty as a strong one. And he thought this had been proven by, well, first, the Revolutionary War, right, when the Continental Congress couldn't effectively levy taxes or raise troops, so the army was perpetually undermanned, undersupplied, as well as by the feckless government created by the Articles of Confederation. So for him, for Hamilton, energy is just the essence of good government. And so he spent most of the 1790s trying to strengthen the government in any way that he could dream up, right? So as the nation's first Treasury Secretary, he developed this really ambitious, sweeping financial program that he meant he thought would help to put the country on a sound economic footing. As a pivotal member of Washington's cabinet more generally, he fought to expand presidential power at every turn in domestic and foreign affairs, particularly while Washington, the war hero Washington's in office, and it was just harder for people to object too much. Later in the decade, as the nation's effective commander of the army during the quasi-war with France, he tried to capitalize on the sort of war hysteria to build up the military, and so on and so forth. The point is, he did everything he could to try to build up the government, and he did a lot. He did so much so that his biographer, Ron Chernow, says that, well, if Washington was the father of his country and Madison was the father of the Constitution, Hamilton should be described as the father of the American government. So he did a lot, but despite this, he was never really satisfied that he'd done enough. And this is because Jefferson and Madison and the Republicans were suspicious of his every move. They're constantly there fighting him, hounding him, preventing him from realizing the full extent of his vision. So around the time that he resigned his cabinet post in 1795, he said that his mindset was, quote, discontented and gloomy in the extreme. I consider the cause of good government as having been put to an issue and the verdict against it. And then, of course, to his utter dismay, we get the election of 1800, right, where Jefferson and the Republicans sweep into office with a mandate to pare down the government's power still further. right? And this is when Hamilton really lost it. He published essay after essay highlighting all the ways in which the Republicans were just systematically, in his view, making the government weaker, the country more vulnerable. In one of them, he wailed that it was in vain that the collected wisdom of America was convened in Philadelphia, in vain that the anxious labors of a Washington were bestowed. So over these years, his confidence in the durability of the American regime, of course, ebbed and flowed over time, often in line with his own political fortunes, but it really hit rock bottom at this time. In 1802, he wrote what I think is a really touching letter to his friend, Gouverneur Morris, in which he lamented that after all he'd done, after so many years of trying to make the government work, it just wasn't going to happen. So in this letter, he goes so far as to call the Constitution a frail and worthless fabric. He said that every day proves to me more and more that this American world was not made for me. He told another correspondent around this time that the survival of Republican government in the United States would require, quote, foundations much firmer than have yet been devised in the United States. So by the premature end of his life, by the time of his famous duel with Aaron Burr in 1804, Hamilton had concluded that their already weak government would only continue to get weaker still, and that little but disillusion and disorder could be expected for the foreseeable future. So that's Hamilton. Next up is Adams. So of all of these figures, Adams' pessimism is in many ways the most predictable. You might even say it's overdetermined. Simply as a matter of temperament, he is notoriously irascible and curmudgeonly. Although he was also, it should be said, much funnier than these other figures. He's quite a funny guy, but he's a very irascible guy. He hated the idea of political parties almost as much as Washington. He worried about the ills of populism or democracy almost as much as Hamilton. And then moreover, unlike Washington and Hamilton, he lived long into the 19th century. He lived long enough to see his erstwhile political opponents, the Republicans, not only win in the election of 1800, but retain ascendancy over the political scene for 2.5 decades. So there are lots of reasons why Adams might have been disappointed, but I think the overriding one, the one that he returned to again and again, was the lack of virtue among the American people. Now, I would argue, in my estimation, Adams was unsurpassed among the American founders in the depth of his knowledge about history and politics and law. So it's an age of course, remarkably learned political leaders, but I think none of them, not even Madison, read as voraciously as he did, ranged as far as widely as he did in contemplating the proper underpinnings of government. And the key insight that Adams took from all these studies was that Republican government depended not just on the right institutions, on the right kind of constitutional mechanisms, but also on the people's character. That he thought that no country could remain free for long unless its citizens exhibited a sense of civic virtue, of duty, of patriotism, right? A willingness to put the public good ahead of their own selfish good. Because he thought that if everyone just pursued their own selfish ends, then popular self-government would just be a kind of insoluble clash of these conflicting interests. But for all that, Adams was never entirely persuaded that the American people had the requisite sense of duty. So as early as January 1776, before even the Declaration of Independence, he fretted that, quote, "There's so much rascality, so much venality and corruption, so much avarice and ambition, such a rage for profit and commerce among all ranks and degrees of men, even in America, that I sometimes doubt whether there's public virtue enough to support a republic." So he spent most of the decade from 1778 to 1788 abroad, right? He's serving as a diplomat in France and Britain and the Netherlands. And during that time, he only grew more convinced that his fellow Americans weren't up to snuff. And so this was sort of the opposite of Jefferson. The time that Jefferson spent as minister to France reinforced his belief in the unique purity of America and the American people. Adams' time in Europe had the opposite effect. So in his magnum opus, a 3-volume work that is called The Defense of Constitutions of Government of the United States, he declared flatly that, quote, "There is no special providence for Americans. Their nature is the same with that of others." So Adams is really one of the first great critics of the idea of American exceptionalism, this idea that the American people are somehow innately more virtuous or more fit for democracy than other peoples were. Adams would have none of that. Neither the launching of the new government in 1789 nor his own elevation to the presidency 8 years later managed to change his mind, assuage his worries. Just 2 months after his inauguration as president, he grumbled that the want of principle in so many of our citizens is awfully ominous to our elective government. The avarice and ambition are too deeply rooted in the hearts and education and examples of our people ever to be eradicated. So he's, I don't know that any other American president has been as thoroughly pessimistic about the whole political order at the very outset of his administration, right? Most presidents, I think, start with great hopes. He starts with great fears. Of course, he faced a pretty challenging presidency. He lost a rather vicious election to Thomas Jefferson in 1800. Excuse me. After which he commenced his long retirement. Lasted for more than 25 years. His retirement was longer than that of any American president until the 20th century. And, during this quarter century, he did experience occasional bouts of optimism, or at least relative optimism, particularly during the patriotic fervor that was unleashed during the War of 1812. But throughout most of this time, again, it's a long time, but most of this time, his correspondence dwells on these same themes about his fellow citizens' lack of virtue and hence their lack of fitness for Republican government. And I could literally just spend the rest of our time here giving you one colorful line after another on this score. His letters, especially his later letters, are just really delightfully cranky. But I'll limit myself to just a couple of lines. So to his friend Benjamin Rush, he exclaimed, "O my country, how I mourn over thy follies and vices, thy ignorance and imbecility, thy contempt of wisdom and virtue, and overweening admiration of fools and knaves." And then to his son John Quincy, he predicted that, quote, "The selfishness of our countrymen is not only serious but melancholy, foreboding ravages of ambition and avarice which never were exceeded on this selfish globe. The distemper in our nation is so general that it is certainly incurable." And again, I could go on like this, but I'll stop there. I mean, I think the point's clear enough, right? That Adams didn't think that Republican government could succeed without sufficient virtue, and he didn't think the American people were up to the task. So in all, his disillusionment started much earlier than it did for the other thinkers I'm talking about today. This was, it started in 1776, before the Constitution's even a twinkle in the framers' eyes, and then lasts for nearly half a century. Okay, now let me turn to Jefferson, whose disillusionment is far and away the most surprising of the bunch, because we rightly think of Jefferson as an inveterate optimist. For most of his life, he harbored a seemingly unshakable confidence in the ultimate wisdom and goodness of the American people. Now, it's true that during the 1790s, right, the Federalists in power, he was alarmed by a number of their actions, their policies, ranging from Hamilton's financial program to the Alien and Sedition Acts. And of course, he fought these things tooth and nail, which led to all the partisan rancor that Washington so decried. But through it all, Jefferson always had faith that basically everything would come out right in the end, because he was confident that deep down, the bulk of the American people were virtuous Republicans with a small r. And indeed, I think also he thought they were Jeffersonian Republicans with a capital R, that maybe the Federalists were in power temporarily as a kind of fluke, above all because of the just immense, unparalleled popularity of Washington. But Jefferson was certain that it couldn't last, that time was on his side. And he was convinced that good had ultimately triumphed over evil when he was elected president in what he immodestly called the Revolution of 1800. So he saw his own election and the election of Republicans to Congress, not just as the temporary victory of a political party, but as the permanent triumph of liberty in America. And then, of course, he serves 2 generally successful terms as president. He hands off the reins to his closest, most trusted political ally, James Madison, for another 2 terms, who then hands the reins off to Jefferson's longtime acolyte, James Monroe, for another 2 terms. And so, in many respects, of course, it's totally predictable that Jefferson retained a sense of hopefulness far longer than Washington, Hamilton, and Adams did, right? He and his principles seemed to triumph in the end, just as he always thought they would. And yet even Jefferson, even the congenital optimist Jefferson, lost his faith in the American experiment in his final years, and in a big way. So there are actually a number of different reasons for his disillusionment that I run through in the book, but the key one was the sectional divide, the divide between North and South that came to light above all during the first great conflict over the spread of the expansion of slavery in America, the Missouri Crisis of 1819 to 1821. And I'm not going to go through the details of the episode, but the bottom line is that the mere fact that some Northern politicians had the temerity to oppose the extension of slavery into Missouri was enough to cause Jefferson to absolutely lose it. So there's a very famous letter, he proclaimed that this controversy, like a fire bell in the night, awakened and filled me with terror. I considered it once as the knell of the Union. And then he basically prophesied the path to the Civil War. He said, there's this geographical line with a marked difference, moral and political difference between the two sides. He says, once this kind of line is held up to the angry passions of men, it will never be obliterated. Every new irritation will mark it deeper and deeper. So he basically, again, foresees the path to the Civil War. And he concluded the letter with a just unforgettable expression of regret. He wrote, I am now to die in the belief that the useless sacrifice of themselves by the generation of 76 to acquire self-government and happiness to their country is to be thrown away by the unwise and unworthy passions of their sons, that my only consolation is to be that I will not live to weep over it. So you'd be hard pressed to compose a clearer, more forceful articulation of disillusionment than that. Nor was this an isolated moment of anguish. He wrote seemingly countless letters during these years, during the Missouri Crisis, each more hysterical, apocalyptic than the last. And he blames the conflict entirely on anti-slavery Northerners. He saw them as committing treason against the Constitution and the principles of Republican government. And Jefferson's views on slavery were always notoriously complex. By the end of his life, I think they were pretty unambiguously reprehensible. I won't say a whole lot more about that now. It's a huge rabbit hole and I want to avoid going down. I again, spend the rest of the talk on that, but I'm happy to talk about that more later if you like. But instead, for now, I want to turn just briefly to another issue that kept Jefferson mired in the depths of despair in the years leading up to his death in 1826. Namely what he regarded as the illegitimate, dangerous centralization of political power within the federal government. So in his old age, Jefferson became an increasingly ardent, even fanatical states' rightser. He's always certain that the state's rightful powers were being usurped by the federal government. And these are Republicans, right? It's almost entirely his fellow Republicans who are in power in Washington, but he saw most of them by this point as little better than Federalists in disguise. And he found the tendency toward what he called consolidation so distressing that he began to wonder whether a breakup of the Union might be not just inevitable, but desirable. So in December 1825, he told one correspondent that there can be no hesitation when the sole alternatives left are the dissolution of our union or the submission of government without limitation of powers. So basically he's implying disunion is preferable to going further down the path that he thought they were on toward consolidation. The following month, he wrote to another correspondent to bemoan what he called the evils which the present lowering aspect of our political horizon so ominously portends. He said that he'd expected that at some future day, the free principles of our government might change, but I certainly did not expect that they would not overlive the generation which established them. So again, Jefferson, despite being so optimistic for so long, or maybe in an odd way because he was so optimistic for so long, ended up being arguably the most disillusioned of all, I think. Now, the least disillusioned of the major founders, as I mentioned at the outset, was Jefferson's closest ally, James Madison. So let me say just a few words about him by way of contrast, as I do in the book. There's a couple chapters toward the end of the book about Madison. Now, I'll be honest, when I started this project, I expected to find that Madison became disillusioned too. Just because, he lived so long. He lived until 1836. This is most of the way through Andrew Jackson's second term as president. He lived so long. He saw so much, frankly, pretty bad stuff that, I assumed that he'd be disgusted by it all, especially by the kind of populist demagoguery represented by Jackson. So I assumed I'd be writing a book about these 5 disillusioned figures. I knew a lot about Madison during the founding. I didn't know as much about his later views. And as I read through them, as I read through the letters, other writings from this later period, the evidence just wasn't there. On the contrary, to the very end of his long life, he remained surprisingly, even defiantly optimistic about America's constitutional order. Now, he did, of course, express some worries at times. He experienced some real disappointments, this you might expect, this, especially during the nullification crisis of 1832, 1833. But these worries were never so deep or lasting as to lead to disillusionment with the political system as a whole or to despondency about its future. And so the obvious question is, well, why is he such an outlier, right? Why did Madison retain his confidence in the government, the nation that they'd founded, when so many others, right? Not just the 4 I've discussed here, but most of the rest of the founders too, when so many others became so disillusioned. Now, one seemingly obvious answer we can rule out immediately, which is, given his familiar moniker, right, the father of the Constitution, you might assume that, well, Madison was sanguine for so long because, basically he got what he wanted out of the Philadelphia Convention and he remained satisfied with the result. But that was actually by no means the case. In fact, he at first regarded the Constitution as radically defective, which is surprising to students. We sometimes describe the Constitution as embodying Madisonian principles. In fact, Madison lost more battles than he won at the Philadelphia Convention, including some of those that he saw as most important. So one scholar has counted up all of the proposals over the course of the summer, over the course of the Philadelphia Convention, that Madison moved or seconded or unequivocally supported. And the scholars counted that of the 71 proposals that he supported, more than 40 of them ended up losing. So he lost more than he won. And at the end of the convention, he was pretty profoundly disheartened. But he soon, I think quite quickly, grew reconciled to the Constitution and became one of his biggest admirers in a way that, say, Hamilton, his co-author of the Federalist, never quite did. And again, Madison's confidence in America's constitutional order endured unbroken, if not quite undisturbed, for almost another half century, right? So not just through the 1790s, by the end of which Washington, Hamilton, and Adams had all grown disillusioned, not only through Jefferson's despondent final years, but also through much of this very turbulent Jacksonian era. So how do we explain this? Part of it, I think, was simply a matter of personality or temperament. So his contemporaries consistently described him as measured and dispassionate and even tempered. He remained almost maddeningly unperturbed even through the low points of his administration, when the Capitol, the executive mansion, were ransacked and put to the torch by British troops. Rumblings of secession pervaded New England and so on. So he's just a more even-keeled guy than the passionate Jefferson, the fiery Hamilton, the irascible Adams, or even Washington, whose pent-up anger occasionally burst through the stoic facade that he generally showed to the world. And so this, his sort of unflappable disposition, no doubt, contributed to his lack of despair. Another part of the answer that's maybe connected to the first is that Madison never had the somewhat naive and or grandiose hopes that the founders had for America and its government. He just had lower expectations for what was politically possible. So he never expected that the American people would always surmount partisanship and selfishness the way Washington did and Adams did. He never expected that the nation would one day play this grand role on the world stage, would compete with the European imperial powers on their own terms, the way Hamilton did. Nor did he even really expect that virtuous yeoman farmers would get together to wisely manage their political affairs on the local level the way Jefferson did. So his lower expectations meant that he was less likely to be disappointed in what America ultimately became. I discuss a few others in the book. Here, I'll just mention one other factor that I think went into this, into his enduring confidence, which was simply that by the end of his life, as the last of the fathers, as he was sometimes called, he had already seen the country endure so much, right? By that point, America's constitutional order had already weathered any number of storms: the Alien and Sedition Act, the War of 1812, the Missouri crisis, on and on. And so he believed or hoped that it could weather a good deal more. So the more the nation endured, the more durable it seemed to him. Okay, so what should we take from all this, right? Let me wrap up. What should we take from the fact that almost all the founders ended up disillusioned? I certainly didn't set out to write the book to draw any particular lesson to be applied today. My goal was just to tell what I took to be a fascinating and too little known story. But I'll conclude here, as I do in the book, by saying just a few words about what I hope readers take away from the story. One thing that I certainly hope they take away is a fuller sense of the founders and their worldviews than you get by just looking at the founding period itself. And this is, when we talk about the founders, we tend to focus mostly on their deeds, their views during the Revolution, and especially during the Constitutional Convention and the ratification debates. But it's important to remember that they didn't somehow stop thinking about politics in 1788. Right? They, of course, kept on living and thinking and observing what they'd wrought. And I think taking a more holistic view of what they said and did over the whole course of their lives is worthwhile, particularly because, of course, their later views are informed by more real-world experience. Right? They got to see the government that they'd formed in action. And so when we're tempted, we're so often tempted to think that the founders had all the answers, or that their will or intent must be obeyed in all things. But I think it's worth remembering this fact that they themselves came to have these really severe doubts about the constitutional order that they'd created. Now, as for all this, how all this might inform our view of present-day America itself, well, I'm afraid that the book's epilogue has a bit of the typical scholarly, on the one hand, but on the other type of character, right? So on the one hand, it should go almost without saying, I think, that the founders' fears and worries are still very much with us, right? So Washington's fears about partisanship, check. Adams' worries about civic virtue, I think we have to say check here too, right? Given the well-documented declines in civic engagement and social capital and voter turnout and the like. That's maybe not exactly what Adams had in mind, but I don't think anyone would want to argue that selfishness has disappeared in contemporary America. Jefferson's fears about the nation's sectional divide too are still with us, right? Obviously, the divide between North and South that he observed eventually led to the bloodiest war in American history, at least for Americans, much as he prophesied. And the legacy of that war continues to haunt the nation to this day, as attested by the Confederate flags that were so prominently flown during the January 6th attack on the Capitol. The divide between red states and blue states has, unfortunately, many of the same characteristics as the divide that Jefferson worried about over slavery. And of course, Jefferson's worries about what he called consolidation are still very relevant, with the long-standing continuing flow of political power away from the state and local level toward the federal government. Now, Hamilton's vision might seem to have fared far better, right? He'd surely be thrilled with America's economic and military might on the international stage, but I think he'd also be fairly despondent about the inefficiency and ineffectiveness of the federal government, for all the government size, how it remains so overwhelmingly difficult to get major legislation passed. And, of course, the American polity faces many, many other problems besides these, right? Some of relatively recent vintage, many of them more longstanding. You only have to look through a newspaper on any given day to see that all is not entirely well with the Republic, right? But this is where I think some historical perspective may be useful, right? So if we remember, if we realize that many of our current political ills were also there at the founding, then we may be less apt to be surprised by these problems or to assume that they'll disappear anytime soon. So to me, too often we seem to expect that with the right tweak to our political system, whether it be eliminating the Electoral College or ending the filibuster in the Senate has gotten a lot of play recently, establishing fixed terms for Supreme Court justices, reforming campaign finance laws, independent redistricting commissions, promoting civic education, whatever it might be, right? Too often we seem to expect that with the right tweak, that we might manage to fix all that ails us. And these kinds of reforms might very well do some good at the margins, but the fact that so many of our problems have been with the nation since its very inception suggests that they may be more systemic in nature, more baked in, right, and hence harder to overcome than we often realize. But it also suggests, and this is the more optimistic way to look at this, is maybe these problems are less likely to ultimately doom the republic than we often fear. Right, so the looming demise of American democracy has been prophesied countless times over the course of the nation's history, each time with assurances that, no, this time it really is the end of democracy as we know it, right? I've heard that many, many times over the past few years. But if we take a page from Madison's book, the fact that we've lived with these problems since the founding, right, for more than 230 years now, despite the founders' own predictions to the contrary, maybe that should lead us to conclude that we can live with these problems for a good deal longer, right? That they're unlikely to actually lead to the country's long predicted downfall. Moreover, however appalling the state of American politics might be at the moment, and I'm frequently pretty disgusted with it myself, it's important to remember that things were far worse when the founders, whom we so admire, presided over the country. So obviously, with regard to slavery, right, we no longer accept widespread chattel slavery or the routine dispossession, even massacre of indigenous tribes. On the contrary, basic political civil liberties have never been extended to more people than they are now. We no longer face repeated serious threats of secession and civil war, as the founders constantly did. It seems like every time there was a major disagreement, one side or the other threatened the breakup of the Union. Political violence is far less common today, right? The very harrowing attack on the Capitol notwithstanding, right? We don't see legislators brawling on the floor of the House of Representatives with canes and fire pokers. We don't see massive violent uprisings like the Whiskey Rebellion in 1794. Our presidential elections, as nasty as they can seem, pale in comparison to the viciousness of the election of 1800, which pitted Jefferson against Adams, two of our most revered founders. Our mainstream media, for all of its problems, is far more responsible and fact-based and less partisan than the newspapers of the 1790s, and so on and so forth. And so none of this is grounds for complacency by any means, right? We have very real, very pressing problems. But I do hope that a fuller understanding of the founders and the founding helps to at least helps us to summon a broader sense of perspective on these problems. So I'll stop there. I appreciate your bearing with me, but I'm happy to try to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Dr. Rasmussen. That was fabulous. In a way, I guess you just answered what was going to be my first question, is that by going through all of these worries and fears of the founders, did we fail them, or it sounds it maybe they were just that they were looking for perfection and realized that in the course of time you're just never going to achieve that, so this was pretty good but it wasn't perfect? And is that fair to say, that we didn't necessarily fail them because 230 years later we're still standing, flaws and all?
Yeah, I mean, so I think all of them, maybe even Madison, but I think most of them would be shocked to learn that America is still around, or the Constitution at least is still around. So one of my favorite stories from the book, I didn't work it into my talk here, but one of my favorite little vignettes is from John Adams when he becomes vice president. He's inaugurated as vice president. This is in New York, where the first temporary capital was. And he writes to Abigail, who's still back in Massachusetts, and asks her to come to New York and live with him. And he says, forget about Massachusetts. We have to regard New York as our home for the next 4 years, assuming that the government lasts that long, right? So they're not even sure that the government's going to last for 4 years set up by the Constitution. So the fact that it's lasted 235 or, whatever, 234, I think that they'd be amazed by that. So in some ways, if we're saying we, meaning the American people since 1789, have, vastly outperformed their vision, despite their disappointments, right? They're disappointed in their fellow citizens, and yet somehow their fellow citizens manage to pass the government along, and to the next generation for 230 years. So yeah, I mean, I guess it depends on if you want to take the more optimistic Madisonian view.
So then I guess the follow-up question is what Rocco asked. So how did we succeed? How did we make it 230 years?
It's a good question. I mean, I guess the constitutional basis of the government turned out to be stronger than anyone but Madison expected it would be, right? So they all had these doubts, including Madison at the outset, but they all had pretty severe doubts. It sometimes you could argue that it hasn't in fact lasted 230 years. We kind of skip over the Civil War, where it's a pretty small hiccup in the historical arc of the country. But we've managed to muddle through. I don't know. Maybe it's luck. Maybe the Constitution was the document of genius that Madison thought it was, at least once he'd grown reconciled to it. It's an interesting question. I mean, of course, many people would say that we didn't succeed, that things are so bad in American politics that you can't consider a success. But the mere fact of being the longest lasting constitution in world history, it has to be marked as some kind of success. Yeah.
Are these divisions and flaws are they just going to be with us for a long time? And what's as you're writing this and putting it in context of what's going on in 2021 and beyond, are you optimistic about the future?
I'm a generally optimistic guy. I mean, I'll have to say most of this book was written during the presidency of Donald Trump, and it was hard to be optimistic. I don't want to get too far into contemporary politics here, but the behavior of so many people in such high positions during the Trump administration made it hard to be optimistic. I'll be honest. So the book was really wrapping up during the election. I was sending the final proofs back to the publisher, like basically as the 2020 election was being decided. And I asked them to hold off for a couple weeks. Can I see how the election turns out, whatever, before I put my final touches on the epilogue, because, there were so many worries going into the election about how it would turn out. And I did have, at least moments of, doubt, again, especially around January 6th, is we talk about the peaceful transfer of power, and it was broken for the first time at least since the Civil War. There were times when I was like, man, should I have written the epilogue as optimistically as I did? I don't know. I don't know that my opinion is any more valid than anyone else's just because I wrote this. I have lots of authoritative opinions about the founding, but my view on the present ebbs and flows, as I'm sure it does for everybody. But I'm a generally optimistic guy. I'm going to stick to my guns on the at least reasonably optimistic conclusion that things are bad, but things have usually been worse than we remember, right? So so you started the question about asking about partisanship, the partisan divide. There's often in American history been really deep partisan divide. The 50s, 60s, 70s was a sort of weird outlier in that the partisan, the polarization was slightly less then, but that was the outlier, not now, I think. So, it's not always pretty, but I think we'll muddle through.
You touched on, I found the part about Jefferson fascinating, and one of the things that we've certainly learned, you prefaced all your remarks that we certainly don't look upon the founding fathers in the same deification way, and I think to me Jefferson has been the most emblematic of that. And I find it kind of interesting that he was worried about the sectionalism, because you're literally writing about the guy who said all men are created equal, but he's not going to get rid of slaves. Part of this was in his own hands. And you had a line in your book that I just burst out laughing. You said, with enemies, when talking about slavery, with enemies like Jefferson, slavery hardly needed friends. So when you're going through Jefferson in particular, did you find this rather ironic, or were you a little bit jaundiced, I guess, looking at him?
Yeah, so I mean, so Jefferson, surely I knew exactly the line you were gonna, as soon as you said that you laughed, I knew what line you were referring to. Yeah, Jefferson comes off the worst, I think, of all the main figures in the book. He, so I've long taught in one of my kind of survey courses in American political thought, I've long taught Jefferson and slavery, but we generally focused on basically the Jefferson of the 1780s, where there is a case to be made for Jefferson. So he's a hypocrite, right? He keeps hundreds of people in bondage, in Monticello and so forth, but he says all men are created equal in the Declaration of Independence. He tried to include a really stinging denunciation of slavery and the slave trade in the Declaration of Independence that ended up having to be taken out to get the Deep South to sign on. He came up with some gradual emancipation laws in Virginia. He tried to ban slavery from the Western territories. He did some real things to try to prevent slavery or end slavery more than most others, even Northern anti-slavery, non-slave holders did. And so there's the Jefferson of the 1780s, there's an interesting case where, could he have done more? Obviously in his personal life, yes, but politically, could he have done more? It's hard to even know what more he could have done. He was already kind of beyond what his contemporaries would go along with. But in the course of doing this book, I got to know the later Jefferson better. And the later Jefferson, as I say, is pretty unambiguously reprehensible. So he, I don't know if everybody here has read the book, but I'll just say quickly, by the end of his life, he supported a theory, a rather crackpot theory, it has to be said, known as diffusion. The idea being that, well, if you allow slavery to expand into new territory, it's not going to increase the number of enslaved people. They're just going to be more spread out, and that they'll somehow be treated better if they're more spread out, and that above all, it would be easier to end slavery because each individual slaveholder would hold fewer people in bondage, right? And so they would have less to lose if abolition were to come. But this is, it's crazy, right? To think that, as I say in the book, to think that you could end slavery by giving it free rein, to say, I have this terrible disease, I'm going to first let it spread throughout my body, and then it's going to disappear somehow. And so he lent his still at that time, very powerful name to the forces seeking to expand slavery. And that's what led to the line that you brought up, where, if he still considered himself an enemy of slavery, but with enemies like Jefferson, slavery hardly needed friends, right? He is pretty, I think that the late Jefferson is really a lot harder to defend than the early Jefferson.
Question from Carol: how did these founding fathers later in their life, obviously some lived longer than others, how did they view the division of power between the three branches of government? Did they feel it worked? I mean, were they happy with how things were crystallizing?
Let me think that through. The division of power. I mean, Madison was reasonably content with it. I mean, Jefferson's biggest worry was about the division between the federal government and the state governments, and especially even more local governments. He just thought that more and more power was being usurped into the federal government. He thought a lot of that was the fault of his kind of distant cousin, John Marshall, Chief Justice Marshall, that he thought the Supreme Court was usurping power left and right. So he didn't like that aspect of it. He came up with various schemes for limiting the power of the courts. It's harder to say for the other, right? I mean, Washington died in 1799, Hamilton in 1804. So, they didn't see it in action quite as long. Yeah, I guess Jefferson had the clearest worry about the separation of powers with the Supreme Court, I guess I'd say.
The question here, you'd brought up about the Missouri situation, and we always look, as textbooks, it's always the Missouri Compromise. So one becomes a slave state in Missouri, they create Maine. There's clearly more to it than that. What was going on, and how did these founders view what was going on in 1819, 1820, 1821 with its ramifications?
Sure. Okay. So the big crisis. So at this point, there are, I forget the number of states. I think there were 11 free states and 11 slave states. Either way, it's an even number, 50 divided 50-50. And so that means, of course, the Senate is divided 50-50 between North and South. And so Missouri is next up. They have enough people, they're applying for statehood. And so there are some slaves held in Missouri, but not, it's not overwhelming yet at this point. And so there's this huge question: is it going to come in as a slave state or a free state? Because this is going to tip the balance in one direction or another. And so they had a kind of referendum that the white majority in Missouri voted to come in as a slave state, but when it's still in the territorial stage, Congress has full jurisdiction over it, and so they could set the terms. And so there's this big back and forth about the constitutional issue, about whether Congress had the power to ban slavery from the territories, or to put a requirement on for statehood for a territory to become a state, whether it could be have slavery within its borders or not. So there's a big constitutional question, and then the big practical question of where was power going to lie. But to zoom even further out, the expansion was the whole ballgame, right? So they all know that eventually as the West fills up with people, as the more and more states come in, if you can keep this is Lincoln's whole line, if you can keep slavery out of the territories, eventually there's going to be an anti-slavery majority, right? Presumably, if you can keep it entirely out of the territories, including the Southern territories, you'll eventually have 2/3 of both houses of Congress and 3/4 of the states. You can just pass a constitutional amendment outlawing slavery, right? And no, the slave states should be too weak to secede or fight a war by that point. And so they saw the expansion of slavery to the West as really the whole ballgame for slavery's future. And this is why the Missouri crisis raised so many alarms, and it did among the South and the North, right? So I quote some letters between Adams and Jefferson, where Adams, kind of foresees like a kind of race war. Jefferson says, okay, if they say that Missouri can't come in as a slave state after they voted to, then pretty soon they're going to outlaw slavery within the Southern states themselves, and then basically the slaveholders are going to be killed by the people that they've enslaved, right? I mean, they see kind of race wars on the horizon. I mean, it's a really apocalyptic time for many of them.
I was really happy when you ended with Madison, because when I read this book, I was like, Madison never quite gets his due as even though, yes, he's the father of the Constitution, but he really has a lot of oomph there. And I thought I was glad that you pointed out him as the moderate, even the optimistic one. So it kind of renewed my faith that Madison, to me, just never quite gets the props that I think he should. So I was happy to see that.
Yeah, I mean, it was a lucky thing. Like I say, I went in thinking I was going to write about these 5 figures who are each disillusioned for different reasons. And then when I had to kind of flip the script on Madison and say why he retained his optimism, I was like, actually, this makes it a much better book, right? So I was sort of lucky that I was forced into it by the facts on the ground.
What I know you just finished this one. Obviously, it was just early in the year. What's next for you? What's the next project?
So the next project is on, I mentioned him a couple times over the course of the talk, Governor Morris, who's another founder who doesn't get enough props, as you say. So Morris was in some ways the key figure at the Philadelphia Convention. So we talk about Madison as a father of the Constitution. Governor Morris spoke more often than anyone else. He proposed more motions than anyone else. He had more motions adopted than anyone else. And then most shockingly, he wrote the Constitution itself. So at the very end of the convention, there's a committee of style that's appointed to write the Constitution, and they hand it over to him. So he writes the famous preamble, "We the people of the United States." He writes, of course, all the provisions have been laboriously debated and voted on by the state delegations, but he's the one who put the Constitution in its final form, chose the wording of its provisions, often in consequential ways. So when we debate about, the fine details of the document, this comma or this particular word, it's mostly Morris's words that we're debating. And mostly it's just an extraordinary fact that, most American school children can tell you who wrote the Declaration of Independence, right? We all know Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence. Even very well-read, very most scholars don't know who wrote the Constitution, and that's a crazy thing. So it's a book about Morris. He was also, I have to say, an absolutely super colorful character. He's a peg-legged ladies' man. He had this very wicked sense of humor. He also, I should say, was by far the harshest critic of slavery at the Philadelphia Convention. He called it the curse of heaven and a nefarious institution. He's really, as you said a while ago, we don't, the founders have been taken down a peg because of slavery, especially Jefferson. I think Morris needs to be raised up a peg among the founders. He was really their conscience on that issue. So there's lots of interesting stuff to dig into there. So it's about Morris and the creation of the Constitution.
Right. Well, thank you for doing this tonight. I love talks like this because we can talk about real world contemporary things in the context of what happened in days gone by, and I think this covers it beautifully. I really appreciate you doing this. I love this talk. This has been great.
Great. Well, I'm glad to have been invited, and yeah, thank you all for your attention and your questions.
All right, thank you very much for doing this. Continued good luck with this book, and good luck with the Governor Morris book. I hope Syracuse is back to teaching in person. And
they are lots of fully masked and all that, but we're in person. Yeah.
One of these days we're going to go back to actually doing this in person too. Thank you so much for doing this.
Sure. Take care. Thank you.
Good night, everybody. Stay safe. Thank you.